family physician, been practicing in Kalamazoo for 35 years. Last 7-8 years, I've been with WMed, and I'm faculty in the family medicine residency program.
Thank you.
I'm happy to go. I'm Chris Gibson. I'm also faculty at WMed. I'm a pediatrician and assistant dean for clinical applications, and very excited to be part of this group.
I'll go. I'm Laura Baller. I'm a faculty member in biomedical sciences at WMed. I'm a microbiologist by training.
I can hop in while my dogs are not barking. My name's Karen Hornifer-Ginter. I'm also at WMed. I'm a psychologist by training, and I serve as Assistant Dean for Culture and Wellness. And very excited to be here. I've read this book and look forward to deepening into the material and learning more. So thanks.
Go next. I'm Shashanta James. I am Director of Student Financial Aid at Western. I've worked at Western a very long time. I am alum of Western, and I'm very glad to be here and looking forward to this discussion and the feedback that will come from this.
I'll go because my dog has also just stopped barking. So I'll quickly dive in. My name is Nicole Mack, and I'm with Bronson's Community Health Equity and Inclusion team. I am the project coordinator for that team. That's a new addition. I've gotten to work with Candace a few times, so I'm super excited about that. Hi. I'm really excited about tonight's discussion. I wasn't able to attend the event that was held a year and a half, 2 years ago because of a family emergency. So I'm really excited to at least, be part of the community conversation about this book. Working really interested in the next book, the 400 Souls book. So having this conversation kind of lead me into that one. So thank you for this tonight.
Hey everybody, I'm Sam. I'm over at I also work for WMed, Assistant Dean. I manage the Innovation Center where we do a lot of startup entrepreneurial work. And yeah, I read this book actually several weeks ago. I didn't know this event was coming up and I read it. And so I was glad that I read it. Now I'm happy to be able to be part of this. So thanks for having it and thanks for including me.
I'm Jennifer Barlow, the hospital librarian at Ascension Borges, and I'm also a member of the Department of Medical Library at WMed. Of course, you can get this wonderful book from WMed's fabulous library. Looking forward to the chat.
Thank you.
I can go. I'm Brooke Kolajasic. I'm also with WMed. I'm in the Human Resources Department. Alumni of WMU, actually majored in sociology. So pretty excited. I had Dr. Davidson for a couple of classes. So it's nice to see you again. Many, many years later. I won't admit how many, but I'm really excited for this conversation and look forward to talking with everybody.
Thank you.
I'll go next because I also majored in sociology. And so I'm really excited to hear from a sociologist. I do work at WMed, but I think I'm mostly here because I have a couple of conflicting opinions about this book. And I read it in preparation for applying to two conferences, ASA and NCTE, with my mentor at Michigan on anti-racist teaching practices. So yeah, I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say for the coming months.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Douglas. I am a organizer and anti-racist trainer with Erase, and I will be facilitating one of the later discussions in the month. So just glad to be here today. I'm also a WMU alumni and also a sociology grad too. So always excited to be with fellow sociologists and to talk about this book. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
My name is Kelsey. I'm a third-year medical student at Western Michigan also. I've been in Michigan my whole life. I love it here, and I'm really excited to read through this book and have these discussions with everyone too.
Hello, my name is Nabil Ghazal. I'm from WMed, Director of Clinical Research Operations, and I'm looking forward to the conversation this evening.
Hi, I'm Maureen Ford. I'm an ER physician at Bronson. I've been doing that for about 12 years and just joined the faculty in the Department of Emergency Medicine at WMed about 6 months ago. So excited that I was one that registered and won a copy of the book. Thank you, Candace. Really been looking forward to getting started on reading it. Just started it today. Excited to talk about it. Excited to be here. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
I'm Gus Calvert. I'm a program manager at the Walker Institute, a social scientist by training, an educator, and a community activist, and enjoy working at the university and working with children. So I love the opportunity to work and talk about this book.
Thank you. So, is anyone? Introductions.
Hi, I'm Dee Sherwood. I'm a faculty member in the College of Health and Human Services at WMU, and I'm a social worker currently serving on the National Association of Social Work's Anti-Racism and Social Justice Committee, and I am very happy to be here as well. I've used Dr. Kendi's book in my diversity and inclusion class at Western, and excited to hear Dr. Davidson's presentation tonight.
Okay. If we had everyone check in, again, welcome. Glad to be able to share this time with you. Don't want to spend too much time talking. Mostly, I think I'm interested in hearing your reactions and responses to this text. So what I really want to do is just kind of introduce the text as I see it and to share a few of my reactions with you. And then I think we will move into a kind of collective dialogue. And hopefully we will all expand and enhance our understanding of what it means to be an anti-racist, according to Dr. Kendi's definition here. To begin with, I think it'd be important to point out that I think Dr. Kendi is using what I consider to be a very interesting technique in terms of the way he is writing the text, okay? For those of you who are familiar with the social sciences, you may be familiar with something that we call critical race theory. And in critical race theory, emphasis is on storytelling, starting from your sort of personal story. And I think that the approach that Dr. Kendi has taken in his text relies heavily on a kind of storytelling and weaving his personal life into a kind of broader narrative of the Black experience in America, and able to address a range of issues, hopefully which we will be discussing here as we proceed. But I think this is very interesting because I think it sort of personalizes the text and allows you to kind of come into it with him and to be able to sort of compare and to an extent contrast your experiences with his experiences as a young man growing up. I thought it was fascinating how he begins the book with a personal experience, introduces you to his parents, how his parents kind of came into their consciousness through attending a gospel concert, which I thought was fascinating, at the University of Illinois, and how their exposure to Black theology, you know, sort of laid a groundwork for their own sort of consciousness growth when they were young people. And obviously developing that kind of consciousness and that kind of an awareness as a result of this experience with Reverend Skinner at this gospel conference, and then later attending an AME church and being exposed to the ministry of Floyd Flake, whom I had heard of when I was teaching back east in Massachusetts in the Boston area. A friend of his, a colleague of his actually, was a minister of a church that I attended for a while. So I'm somewhat familiar with Floyd Flake's work, and I can understand how their consciousness was even more expanded and their commitment to issues related to Black community development, Black consciousness, and the necessity of working together to expand opportunities and to meet the needs of the larger Black community. So I think he does a wonderful job of sort of weaving these personal experiences into his conception of, you know, what it means to be an anti-racist, but also pointing out his own journey into becoming an anti-racist. I mean, I think he wants you to understand from that first initial story that, you know, his consciousness was at a fairly low level when he was growing up. And I thought he did a, you know, it's kind of comic the way he talked about his speech about Martin Luther King and the way he was, you know, sort of harshly criticizing Black youth for not fulfilling the dream and taking advantage of the kinds of opportunities that Dr. King's sacrifices, along with others in the civil rights movement, had made possible. So I thought that this technique is a way, I think, of allowing people to feel comfortable, allowing people to understand that all of us maybe start with, you know, sort of low levels of consciousness about many of these things, and how we have interpreted and internalized so many things from the larger society regarding the experience of African Americans in this country in particular. And so I think, you know, hopefully that will, you know, being aware of the fact that, you know, he is being very open about his own vulnerabilities, his own misconceptions, you know, sharing, if you will, how he feels that he had in many ways been misled by the largest society that he grew up in hearing many of the messages that we all receive about the experiences of Black people and the misunderstandings that we often have about Black people without fully understanding the context out of which many of the behaviors and many of the conditions that impact, you know, African Americans and other people of color in this country, you know, out of our own lack of information, biased information, and how that impacts our thinking and our feeling and stuff. And so I thought in that sense, it's a very sort of personalized approach. And it is one, I think, that really permits everyone to kind of enter the dialogue without, you know, having any kind of, you know, apprehensions about, you know, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. We've all had to struggle with coming into this kind of consciousness and stuff. So I like that approach. So having said that, by way of looking at this stylistic dimension in terms of how he writes this book and the way he sort of uses these personal narratives as a way to sort of invite you into the conversation, I wanted to take a look at some of the things, you know, that he raises in these first 6 chapters, many of which I'm sure we will hear about again as we move through the text. as you can see from the beginning and his definition of, racism and racist, that he is deviating from many of the approaches that exist in the social sciences, particularly in an area like sociology, where I had my training. But one, of course, in sociology text and in a broader national narrative, we place in a tremendous amount of emphasis on the business of assimilation, and assimilation being the dominant model for how the United States sort of became the wonderful melting pot and its ability to incorporate such a rich diversity of ethnic groups and national groups from around the world into our citizenship and into the body politic of the United States, with some notable exceptions. And so, I think that probably one of the first things that sort of hits me as you start to read the text is that, of course, he sees assimilationism as being as racist in some ways as being segregationist, because they both imply that, there's something wrong with people and that they have to be sort of transformed in order to become acceptable, or they are in some ways so different when we use the construct of segregation that we want to push them away and keep them at arm's length and do not, in essence, permit them to become fully integrated or full participants in the society that we live in. And so he sees both of these as as racist. And so I thought, I don't know how other people reacted to that, but I'm saying that is a somewhat different way than the way that sociologists and the way that many of the social scientists in this country approach it, since we, again, have made a sort of bold statement to the rest of the world that we are the shining example as a nation state for our ability to sort of humanely incorporate, at least this is the image that we're telling everybody, incorporate people from very different parts of the world, people who have historically been sort of enemies, if we think about the many, sort of conflicts that they've had on the European continent. And then we think that when these Europeans from these various countries came to the United States, we have been able to incorporate them without, at least that's what we tell, that's the story we tell, without that kind of conflict and animosity and warfare. I'm sure that if we are familiar with the assimilation process that many of the European ethnics had to undergo when they came here, we would know that it wasn't quite as harmonious as textbooks and some people would have us believe. And so, but I don't think most of us would have taken the position that we see assimilation as being basically racist. Although I will acknowledge that one of my graduate professors, when I was a grad student at the University of California at Berkeley, came out with a very controversial text that suggested that racial oppression, assimilationism was in some ways a kind of a racist concept in that it does suggest that we need to transform folks and that there's something wrong with them before they can become acceptable to this body politic. And as you can see in the questions that I submitted, and hopefully I think Candace circulated, that I kind of raised this question about whether or not the assimilation of what we now refer to as white ethnics represents a kind of racism, in the sense that I don't know if the people who were assimilated into the dominant, more powerful group and the privileges that come with that really saw that as being racist, in the sense they were provided with opportunities. It opened up opportunities to them that was denied to others who were in essence kept segregated and kept sort of outside of the mainstream of US culture. And so I thought that those were some of the sort of interesting concepts that I think he introduced. And I also wanted to, you know, briefly talk about his approach to racism through focusing on the issues of policy, public policies, and public policy makers. I think in doing this, he is trying to keep construct of racist and racism fairly pragmatic. That is, rather than it being a kind of esoteric, theoretical, somewhat ephemeral term, he is saying, let's look at it, you know, in a very basic kind of way. That racism in some ways is what racism does. And that one of the more practical ways of understanding racism is to look at it in terms of the way it has impacted people in their lives in the country, and thinking about public policies, particularly policies that have been constructed intentionally to do harm and to exclude and to limit and to circumscribe people's opportunities, is a basic and fundamental way of understanding what it means to be a racist. And that to the extent that we have either knowingly or unknowingly subscribed to those public policies, sort of helps us to get an understanding of what he means about being a racist, and also gives us some direction in terms of the kinds of actions, the kinds of steps, the kind of consciousness and stuff we need to have in order to undo maybe some of those policies, to transform those policies into anti-racist kinds of policies. And so again, I think he wants to keep it, you know, sort of action-oriented, sort of pragmatic, so that we can get a kind of clear idea of exactly about what it is that, you know, he is referring to when he talks about racism versus racist versus anti-racist and stuff. And the anti-racist public policies are those things that are designed intentionally to deny to humanity full participation, to, in a sense, demonize certain groups of people, you know, and I would probably add to that definition, you know, on the basis of physical characteristics and stuff, okay? Things over which we have absolutely no control. And so I think that, you know, in this sense, he wants the book to be not only a kind of intellectual treatise on the business of racism, he also wants it to be perceived as a kind of call to action. That is, if you accept his definition of racist and racism, and you couch that definition and that understanding in terms of public policies, and if we analyze public policies in terms of who they benefit, who they hurt, who they, in a sense, make progress or social mobility, upward social mobility, you know, something that is achievable and possible for certain groups, but not so for others, we can get a better grasp on this business of racism and race inequality in the society and stuff. And so those were the things that I was sort of focusing on as I read the book. And having said all that, I don't think, again, as I said, I don't want to talk too much. I don't want to make this a lecture. So I think I want to kind of open things up now and see how others are reacting and responding, and, you know, what were some of the things that you focused on. We can discuss those questions that I submitted after reading these first 6 chapters, although you don't have to have read those chapters, I think, enter into a discussion of those questions. These were just some of the things that I think that I noted and concerns that occurred to me in the process of reading the text. There are others, but again, like I said, being a sociologist and of course being a college professor all these years, one of the things that we're taught to do early on in our graduate careers and hopefully even before is to ask critical questions. And so some of the things that I was looking at as I read the text was trying to see the extent to which the definitions that he is putting out there as a definition of an anti-racist, help us to understand and to be able to explain, some of the situations that he raises and discusses as he proceeds through the book, as he looks at the historical experiences of African Americans, as he explores the kinds of public policies that was imposed upon them, and then as he introduces the business of white on white racism within the construct of racism and anti-racism, do these definitions hold up consistently and allow us to really understand what has occurred and what is occurring? And so some of the questions that I raise come out of that kind of critical reading and issues that emerged in my mind as I went through these first 6 chapters or so. So let me stop talking and listening to myself, and let me start to hear more from you. So if there's anyone who has a question or comment they'd like to make or like to share, please feel free to do so, starting now. The floor is open. We have no takers.
I can speak up, Dr. Davidson. So I posted this in the chat, but in case some people might not be able to access it, I'll just repeat it. I really liked Dr. Kennedy's framing of racism as a policy choice, because I think it just it identifies a problem like, hey, we have this, we've noticed this is not fair, to these racial minorities. And then it goes straight to the top and says, where did this come from? Who is in charge here? It's kind of like going I don't know, straight to the CEO of Walmart. If you have a complaint, you're like, what's the problem here? How do we fix this? This is not okay. And I was just saying, as an example of this, I think this is a good example, is the energy grid in Texas has just completely failed millions of people in the past week or whatever, just because of a snowstorm. And they've been warned in advance that, the grid is going to fail, you're not investing enough. And so finally that day came and just everything failed. I mean, hospitals have been shut down. People aren't able to get to dialysis. They're not able to heat their homes. People have been freezing to death in their homes in America in 2021. It's unbelievable that this is happening. And I see people saying this all the time about Texas. They're like, this is a policy choice. Policy choices produced this situation right now. There are people in charge that are responsible for this, that have been profiting off of this. So I really enjoyed that framing, as that is the ultimate kind of racist action, because in Texas, I mean, who are the people that are really suffering the most because of this? The people who live in, predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. I mean, Black and brown people. So.
I think that's a good observation. And I think in that particular context, Dr. Kennedy's definition gives us a good way of entering into that dilemma in pointing to choices that people made. And the only, again, response or reaction that I have that would be somewhat critical of it is the policymakers, those who emerged, in that situation in Texas, got their positions because people sort of voted them into that particular power. So is this a situation where people were voting for folk, who out of a kind of conscious racist choice? Or was this, again, as what often happens in elections, is that we tend to sort of vote for people around, sort of emotional issues, whether we like them or not always really paying attention to policy kinds of issues. Although I think Texas is somewhat unique in the sense that, it has opted to take itself off the national grid and has decided that it is going to sort of operate almost as a kind of pure, if you will, capitalist state with no regulations or minimal regulations, and allowing capital and capitalists, fairly unfettered access to power and control and decision making. Now, I don't know if most Texans who are voting in elections are conscious that this is what they're doing, or if they understand the deeper meanings and implications of voting for that particular kind of public policy and what it might mean in terms of how it impacts their lives or can impact their life or their lives in crisis situations or in everyday situations. That is, if we buy into this notion that, we don't need regulation, that we don't need sort of government interference in matters of economic activity, wealth accumulation, and how, and whether the state has certain kinds of responsibilities to its citizens. And in that sense, sometimes I think people are duped by persuasive arguments that suggest that somehow or other it advantages everybody to buy into this particular kind of political economic theory without giving critical thought to what it might mean in a crisis, or what it suggests about responsibility for the common good. And I think part of Texas's problem is that people may not be aware of the significance of policies and actions by the state that have to do with the common good, and how that in some ways is contradicted by the actual practices of those that make the policies and who are responsible for maintaining and monitoring those policies. And so, like I said, I don't know enough about Texas and Texans and their politics, but I just wonder whether or not there is a kind of widespread consciousness about, so I think it sounds exciting and it sounds good when people say, we're not going to have any regulations, taxes are going to be low, and we're going to stay away from those, sort of welfare-oriented type policies where the state is responsible for assisting people who may not be as successful economically as other people. And I think Texas is trying to avoid that, in some ways. And I think they make that sound very attractive. And it makes it sound like you can keep more and more of your wealth. But in doing that, you're not thinking about what impact that may have on issues related to the common good. And it's made most apparent, I think, when we have the kind of crisis that they had, where, you know, bad policies led to, you know, a disaster that maybe could have been avoided had, you know, they've been more conscious of trying to be integrated into the rest of the country.
One of the questions, we have the chat up here, Dr. Davidson. One of the questions is if racism is a power construct, do victims of racist policies have the power to construct and impose racist policies?
As I was thinking about it, see, and I was, as I'm reading, I'm sort of looking at his concern about, for example, growing up in a middle-class Black family. Okay? And when you know, we think about even his early schooling, as his parents are struggling with, you know, do they want him to attend school in the New York City public school system, or are they looking for a kind of private school? And if they're looking for a private school, why are they doing that? Are they doing that in a sense, as he puts it, to run away from, you know, what they see as these children from the poor, and children oftentimes from recent immigrant families and stuff that make up the majority of the student population in New York City, and the horrible reputation that New York City's public schools have in large measure, if we read Jonathan Kozol's work about the state of public schools in Chicago and some of the other cities in the country. And those schools' lack of performance with respect to children receiving the quality of education that they need to be relatively successful in American society, that these schools are failing, but they're failing because they have all of these horrible children in them. And so if we can afford to send our kids to a private school where we can, you know, keep them away from these very bad, unruly, irrational, uncontrollable children, are we making racist statement about those children? Is this a public policy that we in the Black community have the power to, you know, to impose on people? Can we tell folks that they, you know, shouldn't go to these schools? Or can we tell people they can't live in certain kind of neighborhoods? Or can we restrict, you know, on the basis of our public policies emanating from policymakers in the Black community? Can we impose that on other Black people? Can we impose it on anybody? Do we have the power to do that? And so that is kind of my concern there, is that if we're saying that that's a kind of form of Black on Black racism, did Blacks make the public policy that said public schools must be segregated? You understand? And that public schools must be disproportionately populated by children from, you know, poor Black and brown families and stuff. That public schools must have the least experienced teachers and all of that. Were those public policies put into place by Blacks and imposed on other Blacks? And my sense is that, you know, I just question that as a construct as I think about applying his definition of racism and racists to those kinds of contexts. I mean, do we have that kind of power? Can we do that? When the public schools were organized, and I myself am a great supporter of public schools. I think public schools are probably one of the most democratic institutions we have in the country if they are given an opportunity and given the resources and the attention that they need, like to be successful and to accomplish the job that we have set for them. And so I think that the policies that have been made and what happens in public schools come from policymakers who are outside of the Black community and really probably connected to decisions about what neighborhood you live in and whether or not you can live there. So it gets back into housing policies and stuff. Again, policies that we didn't make, policies that have victimized us in many ways in terms of redlining and all of that stuff that kept us out of certain kind of neighborhoods. And so the original construction of the public school system was that they were supposed to be sort of children in the nearby neighborhood. So if we create public policies that produce segregated, even class stratified and racially segregated neighborhoods, then we can see the consequences of that manifested in who attends the local public schools. If I take my family and I move to the suburbs and live with people who make the same, sort of money and occupy the same status that I do economically, then in order to get away from, people who look different from me and who may not be as economically successful as I am, I don't think that Blacks have had the power to impose those kinds of policies. Now, we may be moving in that direction, but my sense is that we're not there yet. And my hope would be is that if we are able to achieve that kind of power, that we would use that power in a much more anti-racist, anti-elitist, anti-discriminatory way. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the kind of critical things that was going through my head as I was looking at that. And again, I may have been misreading it. I don't always say that my interpretation is the correct interpretation. It's just that it set off a kind of red flag for me. That's why I got to that question.
Kennedy asks, can Black people gentrify?
Pardon me again?
Can Black people gentrify?
You mean gentrify?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, I would say they can move into poorer neighborhoods. I mean, I think in some parts of the country, we're starting to see that. That is that some Blacks are making a conscious effort, for example, to move into neighborhoods that are usually described as ghettos and are occupied by what William Julius Wilson's called the underclass, with all the problems that are associated with being underclass, and lack of economic resources, female-headed households, poverty, and that in the range of problems and issues that are associated with folk who struggle with those kinds of conditions. Well, in some parts of the country and in some cities now, Blacks who have been more successful have the benefit of receiving, better educations, opportunities open up to them as a result, I think, of the struggles of the civil rights movement and expanding economic opportunities. I'm making a conscious decision to move into what are once and are now called, poor inner city ghettos. So we see some upper middle class young Black folks moving back into places like Harlem, moving, back to the south side of Chicago or moving to the west side of Chicago and to what are often referred to as very poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods and stuff. And so, and oftentimes, again, doing this for, politically conscious reasons, because one, they want to be around other people of color, other Black Americans. And I think they're also resisting this notion that William Julius Wilson ascribed to the Black middle class of Black people running away from Black people. That is, that we're starting on some level to believe the things that are written and said about ourselves, okay? That is, that we're starting to fear ourselves so much so that we're afraid to live around each other. And it seems to me that they are going against that particular assertion or that particular charge, which is associated with another comment or another observation that William Wilson wrote when he took the position that the Black middle class is, in some ways responsible for the conditions that exist in inner city ghettos and stuff. And so, again, so there are some elements, I think, in the notion and some of the things that Kendi is saying that suggest that he might lean a bit in that direction, or that he has at least been impacted by that argument. And that he even imagined that, or seemed to suggest that his family, his mother and father, had bought into that argument when they decided to send him to a private school. Okay, even though when he got to the private school, his experiences were, far from excellent, and they ultimately had to get a school that was, again, private but closer to the neighborhood that he lived in. And so I think that this business of class antagonism in the Black community is a serious problem, but I don't know if I would buy into the argument that it's a racist that is being imposed by middle-class Blacks. I don't know that we have the power to be able to say that lower-class Blacks must live in this neighborhood and that their children must attend this school. I think we can have negative reactions to conditions, and that we may not want to live in those conditions, or we may not want to raise our children in those conditions. But I'm not sure I would attribute that to a kind of racist attitude that we have towards less fortunate, Black folks. Since quite often in our families and stuff, we have relatives, and oftentimes very close relatives, who are much less fortunate than we are.
Right.
That we move back and forth between what many people see as class divisions and stuff, because they are an inherent part of our families, and our family structure, and our family life.
Andrew asked or made a comment here, public schools being dependent on getting funding from the neighborhoods where they are located is a policy choice. We could easily provide, equal state, federal funding to all of them, but the way we have it, rich neighborhoods will always have better funded schools. I want to share your thoughts on that comment.
Public schools in theory, are supposed to be funded by, from public resources, from the tax base of a city, of a community and stuff, okay? And so we call them public because they are in essence paid for by the public. They exist there to give, all members of communities an equal opportunity to receive an education and to derive the benefits that come from that education, okay? And so if we look at the way housing policies have contributed to segregated neighborhoods and how hiring decisions and the racism that is rampant in the system that has led to Black people being disproportionately working in, low income jobs and only able to afford, the quality of housing and the quality of life that, relatively small incomes generate, then if we are in some way, if we are as a result of oftentimes informal policies, in the South it was formal. So we were confined legally, to live in certain neighborhoods. In the North, it was much more informal and in some ways, but equally as devastating in terms of the amount of segregation that it generated. And so if we are victimized by housing policies that confine us to the worst housing stock in the city and in neighborhoods occupied by people who look like us because we're not allowed to live in other parts of the city. And if we say that, it's very interesting because I go all the way back to the 1960s. There was a book written by a educator, educational sociologist, I think, named Charles Silberman, called Crisis in the American Classroom. And he talked about, segregated schools in Chicago. And as far back as then, we're living in a city where we're saying all schools should be receiving an equal amount of money if they're public schools. That is, we live in one city. The city collects taxes and stuff. And so why is it that somehow or other we still ended up with unequal resources and money being given to schools in Black neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly, of course, attended by Black students and stuff, that somehow or other they were still finding a way, okay, to get more money and resources to upper middle class neighborhoods and upper middle class schools in a city where we are all living in the same city and we're all paying certain kinds of taxes that, and a certain portion of those taxes is supposed to be allocated on an equal basis to the public schools, so that all public schools should have been receiving, roughly the same amount of resources and stuff. And yet, if we went from a West Side poor Black neighborhood school to a North Side upper middle class public school attended overwhelmingly by white students, you would see qualitatively very different, school buildings and school resources and, the qualifications of the teachers who taught there and stuff. And so Silberman was pointing out that this, again, about public policy and public policy makers that were providing unequal resources, in order to to my way of thinking, keep public schools in Black communities as substandard. and that those policies were pretty much conscious. That is, that people knew what they were doing, and there was a certain level of intentionality about that. And so we now find ourselves having inherited the results of that and find our schools in a predicament that is very difficult, you know, like to overcome, because they've been that way for so long. Okay, and I think that sometimes, you know, we have a sense of helplessness about all of that, because we're not always as informed as we need to be about public policy and public policy makers and who it is that we vote for and what we hope those votes accomplish. And if we vote people into certain offices and positions of responsibility, do we hold them accountable? Do we challenge them about this unequal, say, funding of schools in predominantly non-white neighborhoods, and raise that issue, you know, and begin to do the necessary kind of research that documents the fact that they have been underfunded. And the only way that we correct that, and I agree with Kendi's notion here that, you know, that discrimination can be racist and it can be anti-racist. In order to undo the impact of racist discrimination in public schools, we may have to now talk about doing a more affirmative discrimination so that these public schools can be brought up to a standard equal to that of other public schools. And so I think, you know, some people who are opposed to the construct of affirmative action, for example, would consider that a kind of reverse racism, because again, we don't always acknowledge the history of how and why we have, you know, these two different school systems, and yet they're both supposed to be public. You see what I'm saying? And they're both supposed to be receiving the same kinds of resources. So that was sort of some of my thinking on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Kendi's language is so precise, and that's really helpful. In that example, the affirmative action would be anti-racist, but it is discrimination. And he makes that point really clearly. I like how he starts all the chapters with a definition of just, you know, there's one path this way and one path that way. And it just makes it so clear that, you know, there's a choice.
I agree. I agree. Other comments, other questions?
Yes, Dr. Sherwood asks, can you speak to the experience of dueling consciousness? And then there's an acronym BIPOC, and I think this is, I'm not sure, Dr. Sherwood, is it biracial people of color or bi people of color? And then Dr. Sherwood goes on to say, do you agree with Kendi that white people experience a type of dueling consciousness? And then she's referring to page 29 through 31 in the book. And Dr. Sherwood is here to clarify.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Candace. I was referring to what you described, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color.
There's a business of double consciousness that in large measure popularized by W.B. Du Bois in his book, Souls of Black Folk. And I thought Kendi raised an interesting point when he makes the assertion that white people also have a kind of double consciousness. I mean, I think for those of us in the Black community, that business of double consciousness, you know, sort of captures, I think, the reality of being, as Du Bois would point out, being Black and American, okay, like these two warring souls, seeing ourselves through our own eyes as we look at one another and seeing our humanity as Black people, but then also having to see ourselves through the eyes of whites who don't see us as equal human beings. And indeed, in many instances, don't even see us as human beings. And so that while we are a part of this society, we're very much aware of the fact that we are not fully accepted by this society, that we are marginalized. And so you have the one vision of yourself that is affirmed by people who look like you around you, and your humanity is reinforced, and you are a loved and lovable person. And then you see yourself through the eyes of someone else who sees you as a dangerous animal or not quite human, or somebody who is inferior. And so, and those people make decisions that impact your life in ways that you've discovered that you have sometimes very few options, in terms of resisting, and that even resistance can lead to, some pretty ugly consequences for you, especially if the folk have the power to say that that resistance is unlawful, and they're the ones who are making the laws and the policies that determine, right and wrong, and who gets punished and who doesn't get punished. Okay, so he says that, of course, we struggle with that as a people, that this business of being Black and American, and but especially maybe more, I'm going to say more severe, and say what we would call successful Black folk, people who have gotten the education, people who have met all the standards to become doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, or what have you. And to feel constantly that somehow or other you're inadequate because of the color of your skin, and that you're being constantly evaluated as being not quite good enough. So here you are, a person who, you think you deserve to be received as an equal, but you know that you're never quite respected as that equal. And so, you're constantly sort of at war with yourself. This business about being Black and successful, and yet still not accepted, still marginalized and stuff. And so I think we become very conscious of this sort of double consciousness. And he argues that whites wrestle with this double consciousness, but in a somewhat different way. That there's the white racist, consciousness, the notion of being superior, being privileged, and deserving that privilege because you are a superior human being. And so there is that consciousness, but there is also this business of being an American, a citizen, a person who's supposed to believe in equality, a person who's supposed to believe that, people are supposed to be judged, as Martin Luther King said, by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And so we have this business of whites believing, on the one hand, that they're superior and they deserve, the fruits and the privileges that come with that whiteness. But at the same time, they're supposed to believe that all of us are created equal, and that every human being is endowed, as Thomas Jefferson said, with certain inalienable rights and what have you. And so we have the white racist living in his own consciousness with a certain Judeo-Christian ethic that says how you're supposed to treat other people. And so he talks about the struggle between the person who maybe consciously follows racist public policy, but on the other hand, also wants to be a missionary, also wants to be a person that accepts people on the basis of their character, their accomplishments, and their achievement as equal human beings. That these two things are at war with one another. And in some ways, one could argue that it's a sort of reflection of the struggle, I'm sure, that people had to go through if we think about the Civil War, when you had you know, one brother fighting for the North and another brother fighting for the South, right? That one is saying, we want, you know, the country to do away with slavery because we believe, you know, slaves are human beings and they should have their freedom and the opportunities to accomplish what they can accomplish as human beings, just like every other person or every other individual here. But on the other hand, you also sort of like your privilege. You know, you like the fact that you've been able to migrate to this country from situations in Europe that did not permit you to achieve what you can achieve when you came here. And so inside of you, there is this, you know, sort of warring consciousness about belief in equality versus, you know, being comfortable with your privilege and sort of believing that you deserve those privileges, that you achieve those privileges on the basis of your hard work, as if, you know, slaves and the children and descendants of slaves don't work hard. See what I'm saying? And so he is arguing that in that sense, both groups have this double consciousness, and that probably with Black Americans in particular, we're very conscious of it. You know, it's something that we struggle with. One, to be accepted, wanting to be a part of a nation state, you know, that we have fought and died for, that we've worked for, that we've made contributions toward, but at the same time, realizing that, you know, the policymakers in this society will not permit us to be fully integrated or to be fully accepted, to be full participants in a society that, you know, we have sort of made our own, even though we didn't come to it voluntarily. We didn't come to it out of a desire to improve our standing as Africans, okay? We didn't ask to be enslaved, and we didn't think being enslaved was a step up, as many of the racist slave owners believe, or slave masters believe, that we were better off as slaves than we were as free Africans. And so I was asking that question because I think it is an important question that he raises that I don't think many of us consider. I mean, I have in my own head, as I have met and gotten to be fairly, you know, really good friends with whites, and had conversations with many of my white friends about this business of privilege and what does it mean to be white, okay, and how they struggle with that in their relationships with people of color. On the one hand, of course, you know, they've been given some things that, who is the one woman who wrote the Peggy McIntosh talked about unpacking the, you know, the white privilege knapsack, that they've been given these privileges that they didn't ask for. They were just granted them by virtue of their skin color, birthright. And yet there's a part of them that knows that this is privilege and that they have it in some ways much better than people whose skin color is different from theirs. And yet they oftentimes feel powerless, I guess personally, to do anything about that. And so they live, you know, in this sort of double consciousness of white privilege versus wanting to be an egalitarian, if you will, you know, American, living up to the American creed. And so I think he's pointing to that as both groups struggling with the consequences, if you will, of decisions that were made by people in power that impacted our lives, and that I think some of us are struggling to try to reconcile those in ways that lead to greater equality for everybody, and that we, in some ways, steer the country through our actions as citizens and participating in the democratic process. We want to steer the country in a direction that, pushes it to become a bit more consistent, a bit closer to its ideals that most of us, I think, accept as worthy, good, strong ideals and things that we'd like to see become real in terms of its consequences for all of us. So I think in that sense, it's a powerful observation. And it is one, I think, that when I was doing work with Erase, we sort of struggled with that from time to time. And I think people who are trying to do anti-racism work struggle with that. Okay? But they might not call it dueling consciousness. That is that Black folk, because it was a Black author who introduced us, and those of us who found our way towards Du Bois, when we read it the first time, we began to understand, we could understand almost immediately what he was talking about. But I'm not sure that whites struggle with it in quite the same way, that they see this as a kind of dueling consciousness, or that they experience it that way is, I think, the issue that he's raising here.
I also would like to bring up, Dr. Davidson, could I bring up a point from the book? So I think going along with the double consciousness or the dueling consciousness, I thought it was interesting how Dr. Kendi was saying that, being racist or being anti-racist isn't always a permanent name tag that you wear on your shirt and say I'm an anti-racist. Hello, me, this is my name. It's one that you're constantly swapping on and off, and in one moment you can be doing something anti-racist, and in another moment you can be saying something racist, doing something racist.
Yeah, because I think in our society, a lot of the racism, as we used to say when I'm working with Erase, so much of the racism in our society is sort of baked into the society, and that we have come to accept race and racism almost as normal. Okay? And indeed, it is normal. And so if you're raised in a middle-class white community, right, or above, you live life the way people around you live life, right? And you sort of accept that the society is what you are being taught in the public schools that it is, okay? If you attend public school, and I'm going to assume you're probably being taught the same thing if you attend a private school, that everybody has an equal opportunity, that we're the most democratic country in the world, and that everybody here has an opportunity to succeed if they commit themselves to hard work and taking advantage of opportunities that are here. And so it is easy to begin to buy into that narrative that if people are not successful here, it is a result of personal shortcomings. That is, that they don't take advantage of opportunities that are available. They didn't do well at school. They didn't go to school. They misbehaved at school. They didn't listen to the teachers, and on and on and on. They were not good students, or they have, some kind of learning difficulty, or they don't want to work hard, they're not disciplined, they can't control their emotions, they can't defer gratification. I mean, I've heard them all. And so it is easy, I think, to believe, if you're in that kind of context when you're growing up, that the lack of success that many individuals experience in this country is due to individual flaws, okay? But the society in and of itself has no blame, and therefore you have no blame. See what I'm saying? Is that the fact that other people are failing, you don't have anything to do with that. You know what I'm saying? You were doing things the way that you were supposed to do, the way that you were taught to do, the normal way of doing things. So in the normal way that we live our lives, I think it is easy to kind of to ignore inequalities or to accept the sort of broader societal definitions for why people, or rationales for why people are not successful. See what I'm saying? And so the idea is to blame the people, not blame the society, so that we say, in America, we can be whatever we want to be. And then we can point to exceptional individuals and say, see, they did it. That means all of them could have done it, right? Obama became president. He went to Harvard Law School. How come the rest of y'all can't go to Harvard Law School? So that means that he worked hard, he did it. That must mean that the rest of you people must not be motivated. You don't want to work hard. You don't want to take advantage of what's available to you. And so I have nothing to do with that, you know what I'm saying? And the fact that Obama did it means that the society operates in the way that I have been taught that it operates. So everybody has an equal opportunity. If he can do it, then anybody can do it. And so, and in that sense, the racism that is baked into the system lies at a kind of unconscious level in a lot of our consciousness, that we don't think of what we're doing or the advantages that we have been given in the society as racial privileges that may be denied to people of a different color or a different race. We don't see that they're being denied that because they're not a part of our daily lives. I mean, one of the realities of America is that, of course, we live in very different worlds for the most part. The guy wrote a wonderful book called The Closest of Strangers. We live very close. I mean, my mother grew up working, cleaning white people's houses and stuff, knowing a great deal about how they live in a very intimate way, but they knew absolutely nothing about her except that she came to work, and they paid her a minimum wage or less, and that she went back to, as far as they was concerned, the conditions that I guess Black people should live in. I mean, many of them, I think, believe that we opted for those conditions, that we like being poor, and we like having to struggle and stuff, because, I mean, they don't have anything that tells them any different, because they don't know, they're not, or at least, I think he made another statement in there that I thought was very powerful. I don't know if you caught it, but he says, what is it? Denial is the soul of racism. Okay, so if I don't have anything to do with it, and I don't see myself as being personally a racist, then I am not, in a sense, contributing to the kinds of inequalities and stuff that exist in the society, and that get played out in racial terms. And I think, you know, as I have, you know, struggled with this in my own reflections about race in America and how it is lived, that I can see where some people don't have to struggle with that. It's not something that enters their conscious, not something that they have to worry about. I mean, I don't know what that's like. I try to imagine what it would be like sometimes. But, you know, for many people, they don't have to imagine it. It is their reality. That's how I had to come to an understanding about, yeah. Of course, comments, observations.
Kennedy had made a statement here, and Kennedy, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more. She is wondering what gaps we can attempt to address or consider or learn from in the coming weeks, you know, as we talk about Kennedy's text as it relates to America, or as an American, and rooted in grappling with America's colonial and imperial legacy and ethos.
I didn't get the first part of the question.
She would just say she's wondering what gaps we can attempt to address or consider in learning, like in the next few chapters as we keep discussing more about Kennedy's text. And
Yeah.
Feel free to elaborate.
Well, I think, you know, again, I go back to early childhood education and stuff, and how we are, in some ways, I think, and I'm not saying that we're that different from any other nation state. Okay, every nation state, I think, tells its citizens a story, and we buy into the commonality of that story as a part of our identity quite often because we don't really know any difference. Okay, and so the story that we get, you know, goes with Columbus discovering America, and we had the original 13 colonies and the struggle with the Native Americans, and then we, you know, grow into or become a nation state after we have the war with England about, you know, taxation without representation and all that good stuff. But we don't get any kind of critical understanding of what colonialism is, okay? The fact that people were coming from another part of the world and taking control over land that was occupied by people who already lived here, okay, and who thought of this land as their land. And that the people who were coming were people who were essentially invading and coming to establish a dominance over that land and to claim it as their own, and to essentially pursue policies almost of genocide to seize control of that land. And so we don't talk about that dimension of colonialism, and how in the process of doing that, you know, we used rationale such as, you know, one group being more civilized than another, one group being more intelligent than another, one group knowing more about how to use land appropriately versus another group that is less civilized and lower on the sort of cultural evolutionary scale than the group that is coming to assume control over that land, okay? And so there are dimensions of colonialism that are connected with racial theory, racial superiority theory, with ideas about what groups are superior, what groups are inferior, biologically, culturally, and that being a superior group almost gives you a certain kind of privilege to, you know, take control over that land and to create social structures that subordinate that original group that was there. That you essentially, some people call it invasion and succession. That like we not only invade and assume control over the land, we essentially force them out, literally either killing them or consigning them to some small portion of the land that was originally theirs. And so those kinds of dimensions of colonialism, okay, are not talked about. And so the kind of privilege that we have inherited as a conquering group, you know, where we see ourselves heroically as people who are taking on the frontier. I mean, the country is almost presented in the early text as an uninhabited, you know, almost jungle state, where not only did the people have to be conquered, but the land itself had to be conquered. And that we were the conquerors, we transformed it, we put our footprint on it, and look at what it has become today. And so we glorify, you know, ourselves in this wonderful history and stuff. And so what that means, you know, in terms of our relationships with not only those original people, but other folk that come to the country, tends not to be talked about. And then when we talk about it, when we start talking about the fact that once we establish a foothold, assuming control of the land, we invite other people to come. Okay, and we say we need more people, and we make it possible for them to come. We even talk about land that they can get for free and stuff, things that they could not get in the countries that they were coming from, and how this place, in a sense, you know, offers them a new lease on life, the chance to be something that they probably could not be in their own native land. See, what land was oftentimes controlled by powerful elites, royalty, and they themselves were oftentimes peasants on that land and stuff. And so there's a way that we sort of glorify this taking control. And again, I'm not saying that we're unique in this. I mean, I think probably all nation states have a story that sort of glorifies its creation and development, okay? And we celebrate that without thinking necessarily about the underside of it, okay? And so the gaps, I think, start to come in when we start to critically explore, you know, who were the winners and who were the losers in this process, okay? And how that winning and losing, you know, becomes a part of the culture that, you know, may not be talked about as much by the winners. It is only, I think, when the losers start to develop their own voices, okay, and begin to tell their own stories, that we start to get that other side of how the nation came into being, and, you know, what were the respective roles of the folk who came to be the dominant people in society versus those people who were, you know, sort of marginalized in many ways. Yeah. So hopefully, as we go through the text and we get into the next chapters and stuff, as he begins to again narrate his movement from elementary to high school to college, that he's weaving all of this broader history into his own personal development and growth, and his unfolding awareness of, you know, grappling with the complexities of US history and the place that Black Americans occupy in that larger narrative, okay, of who we are as a nation state and stuff. And so yet. So there'll be a lot of things, I think, if we haven't thought about them in a critical way.
Yeah,
think,
absolutely.
We'll start to see the country in some very different ways. Yeah. And hopefully also begin to point to some of the work that we need to do in order to make this, as they would say, a more perfect union. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Dr. Davidson, I was just going to read Kelsey's statement here and then also ask, for others to, chime in. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. I know we have a few minutes left before we wrap up. But Kelsey actually mentioned, she says she feels like how our country's history is framed. And when we learn about it from, K through 12 schooling and what parts of history are included and what parts are omitted or elaborated on is a huge gap, our nation's ability to be more anti-racist. She says that there is so much more that she's learned about, our history in the recent past that, she wished she would have had learned early on, and, or even touched on, in a setting like school that's for everyone.
Yeah.
So that was just a statement from Kelsey. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I don't know. What do other people think about that?
Yeah.
I can tell you that.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say Nicole just was, just echoing Kelsey. She just said that, that was all created and it was by design of why, it wasn't discussed early on.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is how history was taught, how social studies was taught. And it was taught from the lens or the perspective of the dominant group in a white male perspective. There are history books now that talk about what society looks like from the perspective of the Native American, from the perspective of Asian Americans, from the perspective of women, from the perspective of members of the LGBTQ community. And and African Americans and Latinx people, when you look at the same story, our great story of the first Thanksgiving. Well, when you hear the story of the first Thanksgiving from the Pilgrim side, that's one story. If you hear this first Thanksgiving from the side of the Native Americans, that's a whole different story. And now if you look back and it's rewritten, if you look back now and tell how it's viewed, you get a different feel of what America is like. So I think that speaks to that gap. And how do we disperse, I'm gonna say the truth, or how do we get to the truth in terms of sharing that information? I think we are indeed hurting ourselves if we continue to push a false narrative. So I think that's why it's important that we have these courageous conversations. That's just, my perspective.
Yeah, I would just like to share a quick story. Like today, I'm on the school board in Mattawan. I didn't mention that in my intro, so I have a lot of interest in how education, plays into all this. I'm glad we're talking about that. But my third grader was on virtual school today, and because it's Black History Month, they've really been focusing on like reading like children's books about a different historical people in Black history, and they had a Zoom meeting with like 4 Western Michigan University football players today and Coach Lester. And it was so cool to hear even the players, like at the college level, they're all picking different, there's all this history we didn't learn, like as Americans growing up, about important historical Black figures. And they've all picked one to share with their teammates, even outside of their coursework. Coach Lester has asked them to do that. And they're like, the third grade teacher asked the players, like, what does Black History Month mean to you? And most of them are just saying, like, just learning this history that we never learned. So it was really exciting to kind of be there and see that happening for my daughter, and with the hope that you know, I know we have a third grade teacher on the call here. I don't know if she's still on, but it's really cool to see some of that change happening. I know we have a long way to go, but I just wanted to share that kind of positive moment from today.
Thank you.
I think what is difficult as well, or maybe what Kelsey was also referring to, was how not only district by district, there are disparities or discrepancies on what is taught, you know, in history books, as well as public versus private schools or charter, but then even state to state. So, you know, with Nicole Hannah and her 1619 project at my house, you know, it was, okay, well, you can have this, you know, you can play your video game if we listen to 1619. We're doing an episode right now. Like, that's what, you know, kind of, because I felt like it was really important to gather that. And there's still a lot of controversy over that series and who said what and who. And I just think, you know, I recognize racism is incredibly uncomfortable because it does reveal so much, you know, that is wrong with us. And there's a lot of pride about who we are and what we can do and all of that. And I appreciate that, but I don't know, in my personal conversations, I don't want to speak for anyone else. So, you know, conversations with different people from different backgrounds, I feel that people of color have conversations regularly, intimately about race. It's pretty, I can't think of a conversation that does not, race isn't part of, it doesn't come up at some point or another. Whether it was just how you felt in a situation or something, an interaction that you had with somebody, experience that you had. And yet there are, you know, some people and some family members of mine who maybe don't spend as much time with other people of color, but they are white, you know, except for those of us in our family, they don't have regular conversations about race until we gather. And so and that's if it comes up. And so it's just kind of, it's considered impolite and all of these. So if that's how we are in our regular, you know, fireside chats, if you will, in those moments when we have those connections, even in our safe areas with people who we should be okay to talk about those things, textbooks that a state is going to buy versus, I mean, it just feels like a cycle. So I'm grateful that, you know, our kids are learning something differently and they're seeing these leaders advertised, but it's just sad to know that one state gets to say this didn't happen from the Native American side, Indigenous people side, and another state gets to say, yeah, it did. It's frustrating because we're not, I want to stay in our silos. We're not, we're going to interact with each other. We're going to vote for policies that affect one another across the nation.
Fantastic. Other comments? Yeah, I think that, you know, for some of us, you know, talking about race is practically inevitable because we live it so much. And it's such a tremendous part of our lives and it impacts us, you know, all the time. And I think for other people, it's not their reality. And so I can see where, you know, they probably don't talk about it. They don't have to talk about it. They don't have to think about it. Everything is as it's supposed to be, I guess, in their world. There is a kind of correlation between, you know, the narrative that they've been told about, you know, the country and how it was founded and who did the founding and who were the heroes and who made the policies. That is very consistent. And so they've sort of internalized it. So they don't have to think about it. They don't have to talk about it. It appears to be consistent. As far as they can see, those people, for the most part, are still the people who are in charge, who are still making the decisions and stuff. And opportunities are available to them to become a part of that. That is a kind of, you know, natural, you know, overturn. Older people grow old and they pass and younger people replace them, but they all look the same. You know what I'm saying? If you look in the mirror, they all look like you. And so I think everything appears to be normal. So you don't have to give much thought to issues of race until, you know, it emerges in some kind of dramatic way that disrupts, you know, your life in a certain way. And then you're all of a sudden kind of confronted with, you know, certain realities that are related to race. Yeah. And those are unpleasant conversations because, as I said, it's the underside, you know, that of the story that has been kept silenced, and bringing it out into the open and hearing it can be very disruptive. It can be very painful, and may cause us to have to ask some critical things about ourselves that we might not want to ask. We haven't thought about asking. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then I was just gonna read Kennedy's comment lastly, and then we'll close out. Kennedy just mentioned, you know, there's definitely a tension between teacher autonomy and state standards and Common Core.
Was that a comment or?
Oh, it was just a comment that Kennedy.
Comment. Oh, okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I was glad to see Nicole mention the 1619 project. For those of you who have not read it, by all means read it. It is not only a wonderful set of articles and stuff, but there's a curriculum that comes with it. I haven't seen the curriculum yet, but if I was in my teaching days again, okay, starting over right now, I would probably want to teach a course just using the 1619 project.
Mm-hmm.
It is a very, very, very powerful series. New York Times Magazine. You can order it from Amazon. I ordered all my kids a copy. I did. Make sure everybody read it.
Thank you for that. So we are actually closing. Just to let everyone know, there are some comments and some links in the chat. So please feel free to, you know, save those links. There's a couple of books that are mentioned, a couple of different articles, websites that are mentioned as well. So please save a copy that are in the chat. I will definitely be sending out a survey that you all, you know, just to get your feedback on. And again, just inviting you back for an extended conversation. We have 3 sessions, you know, that we are hosting. And I did forget to mention that Lewis Walker Institute will be hosting, facilitating one of our book discussions. Sorry, here we go. So just again, you know, feel free to register. That link is also in the chat for the last 3 sessions. And I just want to give a huge thank you and bring Dr. Dixon back. But I just want to thank you personally and on behalf of all of us, Dr. Davidson, for joining us and having this tough conversation and learning lots of information that, you know, that you added along with Dr. Kennedy's text.
Yes, I want to echo that. Thank you so much, Dr. Davidson. I'm glad stuff is in the chat so that I can actually, there's lots of good information in the chat. Thank you everyone for coming. And also Dr. Davidson had sent some questions, you know, thought-provoking things for you to think about. We will send those out to you. I was trying to do some of them in the chat, but we will send you those questions for you to actually think about, you know, from some of the discussion from today, but will also help you in guiding some of the discussion to come. I think our next discussion on March 11th is that Erase or who is our facilitator?
Oh yes, that'll be Stacy Ledbetter, who will be
Stacy Ledbetter from Truth and Racial.
True Racial Healing Transformation. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Or
She couldn't be here. Yeah. She couldn't be here this evening because she's actually facilitating another workshop. And then on the following, on March 24th, it will be Erase. We have one of the Erase members here. I think Jennifer's here, Jennifer Douglas. And then on April, is it 9th? April 9th, we have 7th. We have Dr. Gus Calvert from Lewis Walker Institute. I can't thank you all enough, and I can't thank the Lewis Walker Institute enough for their partnership and Western for their partnership with this, and all of you all for you know, coming. And the book is just so rich, and I know you know that. It's like a book that you read and you have to just read little parts and you can read it again because it's just so much for us to really learn. So thank you. We will post those discussion questions, and we hope to see you at the next week's discussion.
Can I
Thank
ask?
you so much.
Can I
Sorry.
ask a question before we go? And this is my probably student kicking in, but for next discussion, how many, like, which chapters would you like us to get to?
Good point. Good question, Andrew. Thank you. Stacey's going to lead off starting at chapter 2 through 6. Dr. Dixon, you can.
Yes.
Okay.
2 through 6, I believe. Is that right, Dr. Davidson? I'm not. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
2 to 6.
I sort of covering chapters 1 through 6. So if you haven't read those, I would say get those, and then probably I'm going to think that Ms. Ledbetter is going to be going from 7 through 12 or so, but she will probably cover some of the same things that we covered again as she moves through her discussion. Yes.
Yes, I think your discussion questions, Dr. Davidson, you know, actually have threads throughout the entire book for people to reflect on. I think they're excellent for that. And so with that kickoff happening today, we probably will be covering more, I guess, again, in those first 6 chapters. And we will confirm that with you all, but I'm pretty sure that's what we'll be doing, and going to 7 through 8 or 9. we will actually, and each of the discussant has facilitated questions that they are going to be sending us ahead of time. So we will also include those questions for you to kind of think about so that we have a discussion time. Thank you again, Dr. Davidson. You're like amazing. I wish I was in one of your classes. I feel like I've missed out not having been a sociology student and not being at Western.
Thank you very much.
I feel I got a taste. So we would love to have you at another time. And thank you. And thank you all of you all for attending. Hope to see you all in the coming
Enjoyed
weeks.
meeting everyone.
Yes, and we will
All
send
right.
out the announcement for these questions, as well as, you know, confirmation of all the details for the coming weeks.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.